The Good News Club is a fundamentalist evangelical Christian organization that targets young children, and it does so by using public school facilities. Now, this isn't your mainstream Jesus loves me type of Christianity, but rather an insidious version that fetishizes the notion of the child as sinful and even deserving death and punishment in a, quote, terrible place, unquote. So when I found out that an elementary school not far from where I live had a Good News Club, I decided to find out more. First, I read Catherine Stewart's excellent book, The Good News Club, The Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children. I also went through much of the content of the club's sponsoring organization, the Child Evangelism Fellowship. What struck me most was how open, almost gleeful, the organization was about exploiting the vulnerability of children. Quote, "A child is by nature simple, humble, trustful, and dependent. His heart is open and tender," unquote. And they use these metaphors such as, quote, "The young tree is easily bent," and, quote, "The time to train an animal and teach it how to respond to your commands is when it is young. Later on it will be very, very difficult," unquote. But when I read a particular Good News Club lesson called God's Gift to You, I decided to share it with a mental health professional. The lesson consists of presenting an envelope to a child as a gift and telling the child that they have earned it. When they open the envelope, they find the word death printed on a piece of paper. The child is told that they deserve death and to go to a, quote, terrible place of punishment, unquote, because they are sinful. The psychologist I shared this with told me, quote, "What you are describing here is a good example of how specific beliefs and values can directly lead to mental health problems, affecting self-esteem, self-confidence, coping skills, relationships, lifestyles, personality, and more. For a child to identify himself or herself with a sinful nature, no matter what they do, they will always be sinful to the point of deserving to die, is a very traumatic and alienating belief, since it tells a child that they are wrong and bad for being who they are, that they are deficient and bad to the point of deserving death as punishment. Such a belief is incompatible with mental health. The individual's personality is literally shaped by core beliefs about self, others, the world, and what is good and bad. When a person's core self is identified as sinful or wrong, deserving of death, and this belief system is programmed from a young age, it literally undermines and disables the person's potential, nature, and their ability to see or feel good about themselves and their ability to relate to other people. It is a belief that pushes people to live in guilt, shame, and fear. This was the tipping point for me. I could no longer ignore what was happening right in my own backyard. I looked through the school district's policies, specifically their code of conduct, and it was clear that using threats of death and punishment to intimidate children violated that code. So I took my concerns to the district superintendent. I pointed out the violation, and I asked her to enforce the policy. But the superintendent wasn't willing to take my word that the local club was in fact using the CEF curriculum. So I asked the superintendent to verify the club's curriculum for herself. A few days later, I received a call from the superintendent's office stating that they had contacted the local Good News Club organizers and that the organizers had stated that they were not, in fact, using the CEF curriculum. Well, that seemed to put an end to it, although I still wasn't convinced that the organizers were being honest. The only option seemed to be to monitor the meetings myself, and since district policy states that all such meetings need to be open to the general public, it seemed that my attendance should not be a problem. I was greeted at the school by one of the organizers, Richard, the husband of the local Good News Club leader. Richard was to act as my chaperone, although I would more accurately call him my handler. The kids run around in the gym for a short time and then split into separate classrooms based upon age groups. At this point, Richard told me that I was not permitted in the classrooms because they were taught by teenage volunteers, and the teenagers wouldn't be comfortable with me there. So we chatted and waited for the disparate groups to reconvene in the cafeteria for the last 45 minutes of the meeting. This portion of the meeting consisted of a couple of songs and a Bible story that the kids were told is true because, well, everything in the Bible, according to the instructor, is true. What I didn't hear was any mention of the kids deserving to die, but I was still concerned that I was prevented from seeing the individual sessions. I wasn't available, but the second visit to a club meeting was attempted by a local member of the community. But this time the man that acted as my handler on the previous visit, Richard, told the woman that she would not be permitted to attend at all. Now I realized they were hiding something, and it was important to get access to the meetings, every part of them, to find out exactly what they're up to. The woman that was barred from the meeting wrote to the superintendent and received back confirmation that these meetings do, in fact, need to be open to the general public. Armed with this information, I invited a number of friends to help me monitor the meeting. This time, on our third attempt, there was no problem. We had enough people to monitor the individual sessions, and we sat quietly at the back of the room. We also remained out of the way at the table at the back of the cafeteria that the club organizers designated for visitors at the end of the session. We thought that the club had received the message that when you use public facilities, you need to follow the policies of that facility. This time the instructor seemed to catch herself as she talked about why Jesus died on the cross. Dangerously close, it seemed, to tipping her hand and falling back into the routine of telling kids they're depraved sinners deserving of death. But otherwise, I didn't see anything differently than the first time I visited. And there were no issues. So, when we returned for the third visit to the school, I was surprised to be confronted by Bob Fisher, the New York State Director of Child Evangelism Fellowship. Now, Bob told me that if any of us wanted to attend the meeting, we would need to sign a document that outlined our expected behaviors. Now, the document specified that we were to sit in designated areas and not to take any photographs or video. But I explained to Bob that we were bound by the policies of the facility owners, the school district, and not by any conditions that CEF wished to impose upon us. And the district policy stated that these meetings must be open to the general public. Therefore, I was not going to sign his document. Bob at this point threatened to call the police if we did not sign, and I encouraged him to do so. But, remembering that Mr. Fisher was the New York State Director of CEF, the very group whose curriculum was supposedly not being used, I realized I had an opportunity. I asked Bob, "Is this Good News Club using the CEF curriculum?" And he answered yes.
Okay.
So I pulled out my camera.
I'm sorry, you're Bob Fisher.
Yes.
You're the New York State Director of CEF.
That is correct.
So you're saying the local Good News Club at Fairbanks Road Elementary School uses the CEF curriculum. Is that correct?
That's correct.
There it was. Confirmation that the Good News Club organizers had lied to the superintendent. Now it made sense. All the attempts to hide what they're doing is because they are using threats of intimidation to coerce young children. After I had my confirmation from Mr. Fisher, we then left to monitor the individual groups, followed each in turn by someone apparently working with Mr. Fisher who was videotaping those of us that were there to monitor the Good News Club. When the police arrived, they were quickly able to determine that we had every right to be there, and they let us continue to monitor the meeting. Now, at our most recent visit, which also happened to be the last Good News Club meeting of the school year at this particular school, I also saw Mr. Fisher and his entourage in attendance, but we were not asked to sign any document, and Mr. Fisher didn't call the police. What we did see, however, was perhaps a return to somewhat normal operations of the group. In the individual sessions I mentioned, the kids repeated an exercise in which they memorized a Bible verse. In this case, it was Romans 5:8. But God shows his love for us because, while we are still sinners, Christ died for us. While not as direct as telling a child that they deserve death, it is perhaps as close to their true message as they are willing to go while being watched. And yet the message still reinforces the idea that the child is inherently sinful. So there you have it. Not only is the Good News Club willing to psychologically abuse young children, but they're willing to lie about it, and they're willing to go to some lengths to cover up that lie. So, what will you do? We'll press school officials to enforce their policy, and we'll make it clear that when it comes to children, anything less than protecting the most vulnerable in our society is not acceptable. So, what can you do about it? Find out if there's a Good News Club near you. Let the school know that the psychological abuse of children is not acceptable. Attend the Good News Club session, and, if permitted by state law and the school, record what you see there. This simple act of monitoring the group may actually prevent some of the abuse, It almost certainly did in our case. Now, the subtitle of Catherine Stewart's book is The Christian Right's Stealth Assault on America's Children. The Good News Club tactics only work when we let them abuse children behind the cloak of lies and intimidation. We can't let that happen.